Next, we're going to look at how to put actionable data in the hands of providers and explore the future of query-based exchange. Establishing query-based exchange between providers and the places where the patient data lives is a core tenet of the ONC's roadmap for interoperability. Whether the exchange occurs through legacy methods or through fast healthcare interoperability resources, what we call FHIR, query-based exchange continues to grow. A building consensus among health information stakeholders indicates actionable data is critical to the timeliness of patient care, quality, and cost. Our moderator for this session is Matt Englehart, Senior Digital Services Product Manager at MiHIN, where he leads internal and external development teams to create and launch products in response to consumer and market-based needs, and drives product development and its adoption throughout the organization, its network, and services. Matt's current focus at MiHIN is to lead the development and adoption of Interoperability Land, a collaborative, on-demand test platform hosted in the AWS cloud that allows advanced interoperability testing and development across different organizations and systems. Our speakers include Lloyd McKenzie, Senior Consultant at Information Technology Services, Jevity Consulting. He has been involved in healthcare standards development and data modeling for 20 years and has taught, designed, and assisted in implementations of HL7 version 2, version 3, CDA, FHIR, and many other healthcare-related standards. As one of the initial 3 principal developers of the HL7 FHIR specification, Lloyd helped lead the development of transformative standards before it was even called FHIR. He serves as co-chair of HL7's FHIR Management Group and the FHIR Infrastructure Work Group, and acts as a community support coordinator, helping to ensure that the community remains supportive of new developers. We also have Adam Culbertson, Health IT Program Manager at Boston Children's Hospital, a Harvard Medical School affiliated teaching hospital. In this role, Mr. Culbertson is an advocate for interoperability and leveraging the SMART API standards to advance nationwide interoperability. Previously, he was the HIMSS Innovator in Residence. In this role, he founded their developer and data science outreach, as well as created the developer innovation labs for HIMSS. He has worked with companies to promote API-centric and interoperable solutions for healthcare. In addition, he is nationally recognized as a speaker on the topics of patient data matching. He's worked with the ONC and the Chief Technology Officer at HHS to advance patient data matching with the development of the Patient Matching Challenge. We also have Drew Ivan, Executive Vice President of Product and Strategy at Rhapsody. His focus is on how to operationalize and productize integration technologies, patterns, and best practices. His experience includes nearly 20 years in health IT, working with a wide spectrum of customers, including public HIEs, IDNs, payers, life sciences companies, and software vendors, with the goal of improving outcomes and reducing costs by aggregating and analyzing clinical claims and cost data. That's quite a panel. Please join me in welcoming Matt, Adam, Drew, and Lloyd.
Thank you, Shelley, for that introduction, and thanks all for the opportunity to speak here today. Let's work this out. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to introduce the topic of query-based exchange, and then I'm going to turn it over to our speakers to talk individually about different topics related to query-based exchange. So what is query-based exchange, or health information exchange in general? Health information exchange gives providers the ability to access and share critical medical information with other participants in the healthcare ecosystem across a healthcare network electronically. So the ONC has identified 3 main categories or types of health information exchange. There's directed exchange, which is really an information source directly sending information to a recipient. And the easy example of this is direct secure messaging. So a primary care provider refers a patient to a specialist and sends a care summary directly to that specialist. So there is a known recipient. Query-based exchange is more of a pull model where the exchange originates with a query initiator, and they structure some query which is propagated across a healthcare network. Information is discovered on the network that's relevant to that query, and then it's returned to the query initiator. And that's more of a pull model, and it's more like Google, where you enter a search, you really don't know where that information may be returned from, and then you get results. And then the last type that ONC identified is consumer-mediated or patient-mediated exchange. And this is an exchange model where the patient lives in the middle as the broker, and they identify the information source and direct information to the recipient or recipients. So this puts them in control of where information is moving across the network. So this session is focused on query-based exchange. So specifically, query-based exchange allows query initiators to search across a healthcare network for clinical data and get relevant data back. It's particularly useful in unplanned care scenarios. So if you're in an emergency room and a patient comes in and you identify the patient, you could structure a query that could turn relevant clinical information about that patient before you make treatment decisions about them. There's also a lot of potential related to query-based exchange with the transition to value-based care as identified in Da Vinci use cases. So searching for clinical quality, measure evaluations, searching for gaps in care, things of that nature. In the real world, query-based exchange is personified by document search and record location services. And these are defined by IHE profiles and implemented by alliances like Commonweal and Care Quality. There is a significant opportunity to implementing query-based exchange across a network of open APIs that expose clinical data and patient-related data through a network. And that, if you think about the CMS and ONC proposed rules like our previous speaker just reviewed, and you make the logical assumption that at some point in time, the healthcare network is going to be composed of organizations that expose their data on patients through open FHIR APIs or other APIs, then it's easy to see how powerful query-based exchange could be, i.e. the capability to query a vast network of information and receive highly relevant results from the network. So that's kind of what we're talking about. But the issue is that there are significant barriers to realizing that capability, and those are related to how you go out onto a network of disparate data sources and identify where that relevant data lives. So that's an interesting problem that has to be solved. You also need to deal with permissioning the query initiator. How do you know they have the rights to access that data? And all of that data is different. It can be general PHI or it could be specially protected PHI. And then lastly, you really need to have a consistent method to manage identity of patients or providers across the network so that when you return data to a query, there's a highly reliable mechanism in place to ensure that the data that's being returned is related to the patient that you're querying for information for. So with those opportunities and barriers in mind, we structured the Connect-a-thon that launched this week's conference around exploring synergies between healthcare and finance related to 3 challenge themes. And these challenge themes really intersect closely with query-based exchange. So we wanted participants to explore open APIs and business models, digital identity proofing solutions, which is a barrier for query-based exchange, and then highly personalized data-driven experiences, which is really another way to say what would you build if you could query a network and return data from the network about patients? What would that allow us to do that we can't do today on point-to-point queries and things of that nature? So that was the event. We had a big group of people from a broad diversity. We had finance, healthcare, clinicians. We had a lot of developers. And what we did was we broke up into 8 teams, and each team picked a solution aligned to those challenge themes or use cases. And we gave them 10 APIs and said, go out and build something that solves a problem or addresses a barrier in that space. And the APIs that we had were Interoperability Land, which is a product that MiHIN is developing that enables interoperability testing. So it's a bunch of healthcare organizations that have FHIR APIs that allow you to get at synthetic patient data in those healthcare organizations. We had finance APIs like Yodely, which lets you get at bank account information. We had Dayon, which does biometric digital identity proofing. Blue Button, which is benefits and claims data for Medicare on FHIR. For Medica, which is patient matching, and several others. And we challenged the teams to create innovative solutions that query these APIs and query an open FHIR API network and create something interesting. And what we got were some really fantastic solutions built in just 24 hours. And the interesting thing to this session is that in one way or another, directly or indirectly, every one of them was related to query-based exchange, whether they were creating vision and around what you could do with query-based exchange on open APIs, or if they were addressing a barrier and trying to say, here's how you could overcome that barrier. And just to go through at a high level, we had a solution that used biometrics from Dayon. They used patient matching from For Medica, and they created this frictionless digital identity proofing solution that would let people verify their identity so they could access data across a network. So that was pretty interesting. That was focused on a barrier that would enable query-based exchange. We also had a blockchain and biometric solution that was probably more patient-mediated health information exchange, but it addressed some of the barriers to query-based exchange. We had a team that worked on creating a provider endpoint discovery service, and then they layered in patient consent to make sure that providers had consent to access the different data on the network. And then we had a patient-centered care, which was a mobile app, which allowed a patient to query the network, bring back disparate healthcare information, and then they also hit that patient's bank account, and they created kind of an affordability, price transparency experience in their app. So that was really interesting. And then the last one we're talking about is there was a dashboard for providers that queried the network to look for readmissions data to help them understand the cost and complexities related to readmission, and created these really cool data visualizations. So the point of that is that there's a lot of opportunity related to query-based exchange, especially when you marry it to open APIs. There's a lot of vision and energy in the space around what you can do with that and how to solve the barriers to it. And I think it's going to be a really interesting space over the next several years, especially given TEFCA and the proposed rules to watch. And I'm pretty excited to hear what our speakers have to say about that. So thank you, and I will introduce Adam to the podium.
Thank you, and thanks for the presentation, and always fun to come back. I'm actually from Indiana, so it's just always fun to be back in the Midwest. And Elise, excellent presentation. You keyed me up well to talk about APIs. So my name is Adam Culbertson. I'm with the SMART program. We're just going to fly through some of these slides because I want to allow some time for discussion. But about me, I joined the SMART team. I used to be at HIMSS, and then I was an innovator in residence at ONC, which I like to describe as being a glorified intern. And then I spent some time at the National Library of Medicine. So disclaimer, you can read it. We'll move on. So how many people are familiar with the basics of an API? Seems like we have a pretty good. So I always like to kind of do a level set. So anybody have any good food here in Lansing? So an API, I always tell people, is just like a menu. So it tells you what items are available and how much they cost, right? And so in the same way, I'm not going to go to a burger joint and order a taco. I'm not going to go to the Cerner API and expect to get my banking data. That would be crazy. So, so an API is really just a menu, and it tells you, what, excuse me, what's available and how you can get it. And so why now? I think Elise really hit on this, right? So changes 21st Century Cures Act. There's a pending rule coming out that points to the FHIR API and the Smart on FHIR authentication standard. So I'm just going to skip through this. But one of my favorite examples of why APIs are really powerful and why I'm really excited about APIs is Uber. So despite Uber's really disappointing recent IPO, it's a really cool company, right? Because Uber didn't build a maps platform. They didn't build a payment platform. They didn't build a text platform that sends you the message that says, hey, your Uber's coming. They did this through a mashup of APIs. And so as these different healthcare APIs become available and we're able to pull data from them, the possibility exists today to do some really interesting things. And Matt talked about that in the Connect-a-thon, right? We can build things really fast and really seamlessly and really quickly. So this is a great quote. EHR has become a commodity platform. The winner will be an EHR vendor that provides the best platform for innovation, the most open and extensible platform, right? So we're in the world of API-driven healthcare. And so I want to just talk a little bit about some of the pieces that sort of make this up. So FHIR, I think Lloyd has much more greater expertise on this, so I'm going to just shoot through this. But it stands for Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. It's just an exchange standard. It's built off the HTTP protocol. And it's both a community and a standard. So Graham Grieve, really great guy. If you ever get a chance to meet him, talks about both the standard and the community. And the community is actually really fun to be a part of. So come to a Connect-a-thon, make new friends, build something. So the basic idea is right behind FHIR is you have resources and methods. So this is just a snapshot from the HL7 page. These are the different resources that are available. So I talked about the menu, right? So this page of the different resources is sort of like the menu of different resources that are available. And then requests, so methods. So resources and methods. So there's different methods that tell you how to access. So we're talking about query-based exchange. So there's something called an HTTP query. And I can use these different methods to get certain pieces of data. So I could say, get me the hamburger resource, and it would pull back that resource, right? Or, in thinking of healthcare, right, I could do a post, and I could do a post of a lab result to an EMR, right? And so this is one of my favorite sort of summary slides by Ed Martin at the University of California, San Francisco, right? So they have the notion of clients and servers, and then we have these methods in between, and everything sort of comes together through those things. So, so you can see the notion. You have a client, you have a server, and you have the methods, right? So, so we put them all together. The FHIR search API, right? You have an endpoint, so that's the point where your restaurant would be. So in this case, it's a URL, and then you can say I want to get a given patient, right? I can do a query. So FHIR using the FHIR test server, and then I can do a patient search. Lisa Coleman, right? So Smart is a combination of things. So Smart basically is FHIR plus something. So it takes the FHIR resources, and the idea is that we can build these apps using all these different resources and the APIs. So the idea is build once, deploy multiple times. I'm going to just kind of skip, right? So this is probably the best slide that describes Smart, right? It's the FHIR API plus OpenID, Connect, and OAuth, right? So we put all these open standards together, and now all of a sudden, we're in business, we're building apps, which is really fun. So I'm with the Smart program, so we have an app gallery. So it takes these different APIs, takes this data, and you can put it together to build different apps. So these are a few examples of some of the apps in our app gallery. So I like the Duke Pillbox apps, great example. Emerging work, so all these things can be put together. There's CDS hooks. That allows you to call third-party service. So just moving quickly, then we're doing some work with bulk data. So Elise talked about part of the rule is that we want people to be able to get and transfer data. So if I go from one EMR to another, the Smart on Fire is good for single patients, but it doesn't do whole EMR. So bulk data is the sort of technical means in which I could export a whole EMR or a whole group of patients. I'm going to just kind of keep moving because I know we have. And then, right, so this is all built off, the whole Smart team, we leverage, software libraries for developers, so we use the open stack. And I'm going to, system tools and resources, and I'm going to turn it over to Lloyd.
Thanks, Adam. So Graham came to HL7 almost 8 years ago with an idea that he called Resources for Health. And we've done a fair bit since then. We've largely reshaped how HL7 works in terms of its processes and priorities. We've held connectathons, probably over 100 by now. We've formed fire communities on every continent except Antarctica. If anybody's going down there and wants to sit one up there, talk to me. I'd love to complete my, my map. And we've moved fire into production, most importantly, in thousands of sites throughout the world. And so the question is, what do we do next? We're pretty clear within HL7 on sort of what our trajectory is. For the common clinical data that most EHRs and similar systems care about, we've got the data structures in place, we've got the resources designed. We might possibly need a couple more, but we think we've got most of the space covered. But we are going to continue to develop new ones, new data structures for areas of care that we haven't traditionally done interoperability with, and also for areas of care that might have been a bit slower to adopt FHIR, primarily in areas that are heavily regulated, which tend not to be early adopters of anything. You can see some of that in Release 4 of FHIR. We've got a section that deals with regulated drug products, which some people think is a little bit different, but it's a different area, and so we're bringing things in like that. In Release 5, you'll see some things around evidence-based medicine and maybe some stuff from public health, and so there will continue to be new content. However, as you can see from the graphs, and of course they're forward-looking, so take them with a grain of salt, we're going to be moving more and more of the resources to normative, meaning that we're locking things down as we start to get enough implementation experience where we can be confident in locking those things down. 10-ish years from now, most of the resources in the FHIR specification will be locked. But the things that most of us care about, things like allergy intolerance and procedure and prescriptions that we use every day, those are slated to be locked down hopefully by the end of 2020, certainly by early 2021 at the latest. And as we increase the stability of the content in the FHIR core specification, the amount of energy that we put into that spec is going to continue to decline. And so what are we going to do with that energy going forward? As Adam mentioned, there's some really cool things that we've built on top of FHIR, and not just us, but external organizations that came and looked at what FHIR had to offer and said, yeah, we can use that and take their ideas and build that on top. And so things like SMART and CDS hooks, as well as newer technologies like bulk data and FHIRcast, are going to continue to come into play, and we'll be working to support those and develop those and enable those. These additional technologies that sit on top of the FHIR stack are really the most exciting part about FHIR to me, because they enable new architectures, they enable new business models, and that means that they have the power to really transform things. The other thing that we're going to be worrying about is supporting the implementer community. So additional tooling, more reference implementations, visualization tools, the ability to convert data from other standards, be that HL7 standards or others, translating into other languages. We've got people who voluntarily translate FHIR into Russian, into Chinese, and we want to continue to enable that. But most of our energy is going to be in the space of implementation guides. That's both for HL7 as an organization, but the much broader community as well. The base fire specification gives you a framework for data sharing, API. But it doesn't necessarily by itself solve real business problems. To do that, you need to have a layer on top, and that's what an implementation guide does. It takes the structures and the interface that FHIR defines and says, how do you use that to meet US meaningful use requirements? Or how do you use that to share genomics reporting data? Or how do you use that to get a provider registry that actually works? And we need lots of implementation guides because there's a whole lot of problems in the healthcare space that we need to solve. Right now, we have 20 to 30 implementation guides that HL7 develops every year. We're expecting that number to double or triple, and of course, the amount that HL7 does is a small fraction of what's actually happening throughout the world as a whole. As Adam mentioned, one of the key things that we always talk about with FHIR is that FHIR is a community. It's the people who build the tools, it's the people who ask questions and who answer questions, and thus nudge implementations towards greater consistency. It's the people who actually use FHIR and who report when they encounter issues so that we can fix those in future versions of the spec. That community has grown into the thousands, and it's continuing to get bigger. But the community is not just about SDOs, and it certainly isn't just about HL7. There's a number of other organizations. IHE is going full blast, developing FHIR profiles. X12 and NCPDP have both cooperated with HL7 in producing implementation guides. And there's new groups like DaVinci and Karen Health Alliance and others, Argonaut, that have formed specifically around FHIR and creating implementation guides and bringing that work forward. For those that are older SDOs, one of the cool things that I hope and see signs is starting to happen is that they can actually take FHIR and develop implementation guides themselves. They don't need to do stuff through HL7. The standard is free, the tools are free, and so anybody can take and use that. And that's also true for organizations that haven't traditionally done standards at all. So things, groups like ASCO, American Society for Clinical Oncology, can take the work that HL7 and others have done and build on that and give guidance on how their particular community should be using APIs to solve their business problems. Obviously, as the community continues to grow, we're going to hit some challenges with scalability. We've got lots of different organizations, lots of different cultures. We want to maintain FHIR as open and practical and implementer focused, but that's not necessarily going to be easy. HL7 is working with other SDOs to develop a FHIR community process that will helpfully increase the consistency and coordination as we continue to try to solve problems. FHIR is going to continue to penetrate new spaces, and we will see those who have adopted version 2 or CDA starting to leverage the mapping work that we've done to create parallel interfaces that support FHIR. We may also find that those who do those parallel interfaces find that they don't get the full benefit of FHIR without doing some re-architecting, and so we may see some work happening there as well. There will, of course, be talk of certification as the FHIR specification starts to stabilize. We don't know exactly what that's going to look like from HL7's perspective. ONC has some ideas about how it'll work in the US, but how that's going to work worldwide, we don't yet know. We will also see implementations starting to move up the stability stack. So you start with read-only interfaces because that's the easiest thing to build. And then you start to allow other applications to write into your system, often things like observation or documents which you just write once and those are easy. But then you move on to more sophisticated things, being able to share care plans or dynamically update encounters or manage a shared condition. And then on top of that comes the most complicated thing, which is integrating business processes. So allowing systems to manage workflow, to initiate orders, to cancel orders from outside your system. And that's not something we're seeing a whole lot of because it's really hard for implementers to figure out how to make that happen. As we move up that maturity scale, we need more and more standardization, more and more implementation guides. So we need to standardize what the codes are. How are you going to define the specific data structures. So how do you share an APGAR, for example? And then we move on to trying to standardize business processes, because you need that if you're going to allow other people to start to change what it is that your system's actually doing. And that's going to mean greater engagement with providers, because we're not going to get the change that we need without actually changing clinician processes. When we started out with FHIR, we said that we needed to do 3 things. We need to disrupt healthcare standards, so change the way that healthcare actually standards work, getting them more focused on how we're going to focus on implementation rather than just getting something out there published. We wanted to disrupt healthcare IT, and bringing APIs into the space has really changed how healthcare interoperability works. We're moving from a messaging and document-centric space to a dynamic query-based space. And then finally, we wanted to change healthcare. And this is the part that we are just starting to get to, where we really want to deliver different means of helping people be healthier and improving the treatments that are offered. And that's the kind of thing that we focus on here. And so there's a lot more work that we need to do in this space, but we're starting to have the tools that make that happen. Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, so I want to move it up a level and talk about the forest instead of the trees. Because what we found is that interoperability means different things to different people. And I wanted to start with a sketch of the overall landscape, the map of what interoperability means. And so I'll start down there at the bottom at the Internet of Medical Things, IOMT. And that's divided into 2 parts from our perspective. One is medical devices that are found in the hospital at the patient bedside, for example. And those are generating tons of data all the time, but it's not really that useful if it just sits on the device. It needs to be moved up into the hospital network so that it can be stored in an EMR or a data warehouse, something like that. The other half of the Internet of Medical Things is the consumer devices. It's the Fitbits and the Apple Watches and so forth. And we'll talk about where that data goes in a second. But I want to focus on that center box, the hospital or organizational level of interoperability. Because this is where a lot of the focus of interoperability exists. This is where HL7 started. The version 2 standard is all about moving data around within a hospital setting. And once the idea of interoperability within a hospital is pretty well established, you can start to think about transferring that data across outside of one hospital to a different hospital, or to a payer, or to public health, or an HIE. And so that's the top box on the diagram. That's the cross-organizational interoperability concept. Over on the left, we have the community of vendors and implementers that serve all these different layers. So this is all the software vendors that make up the healthcare IT community. They're all interested in interoperability as well. And then over on the right, we have the patients. Those are patients and consumers are starting to get in on the act of interoperability. So this is where we see the breakdown of interoperability into different types of workflows. And it's useful and interesting to think about this map, because all of us in the room belong to some organization or other. We're doing some sort of interoperability. And you can sort of think about which box you're doing your interoperability in. You can classify the type of interoperability you're doing. And you might do more than one. So you might move from box to box over time. And that's actually what we're seeing the industry do. We're seeing a focus moving from within organization or hospital interoperability to the cross-organizational interoperability. And there's lots of reasons why we're doing this. Some of the reasons are listed there on the right. And this is happening, this is true in the US as well as the rest of the world. We're seeing this on a global scale. That in order to enable transitions of care, you obviously have to be able to transfer data along with the patient from one care setting to another. Controlling costs, for example, through an ACO organization or an ACO arrangement is something that requires sharing data between payers and providers. And then finally, we have federal mandates. And this is, like I said, true in the US. There's different federal mandates elsewhere in the world. But here in the US, we have the rules we talked about this morning from ONC and CMS, as well as TEFCA And that's increasing the need to do this cross-organizational interoperability, as well as the patient-oriented interoperability. And so the question is, where does query-based exchange fit into this interoperability landscape? Because that's what the session is about, is query-based exchange. And we're seeing query-based exchange, actually it applies to any of the boxes on this diagram. You can use query-based exchange in any of these interoperability settings. But where it's most commonly used, I think, is in the cross-organizational interoperability, and also in the interoperability that is patient-facing or consumer-facing. And there's a number of technologies that enable this or make it easier. One is the IHE style integrations. So there's a lot of IHE profiles that enable query and response, data discovery, patient identification and discovery. And so that's a technology, it's a set of standards that really helps enable query directed exchange in the hospital as well as the cross-organizational settings. But more recently, we're seeing FHIR come onto the scene. And that's a standard that I feel is designed from the ground up to really enable query-based exchange, because it's based on a set of technical standards that are ideal for asking for data and getting a response almost immediately with the data that you asked for. So it's a perfect match for a query-based exchange. And then finally, there's good old HL7 version 2. Which actually does support a query and response pattern. We usually think of HL7 version 2 as being an event-based model that sends out a packet of data in response to a real-world event. A patient gets admitted, for example, to an emergency room, and that turns into an ADT message in HL7. And then that ADT message can be converted into some other type of notification, perhaps to a doctor's pager or mobile phone, that tells the doctor in real time that there's a clinical event happening. But that's only one model that HL7 version 2 can be used in. It can also be used in a query response mode. So there's quite a bit of query response happening in HL7 version 2 as well. And like I said, this is really enabling a better connections across organizations. So that's the cross-organizational interoperability box for sure. But it's also the pattern, I think, that will be used as patients start to get access to their own data. And when we think about patient-mediated exchange, that's really nothing other than the patient pulling their data from one setting and filtering it perhaps or validating it and then pushing it to another setting. So the patient-mediated exchange really does combine the push-based model of interoperability with the query-based model of interoperability. It puts the patient in the middle as the filter and the router. So this is kind of the overall landscape that I think of when we talk about interoperability. And it's a useful model to keep in mind as we talk about the different types of interoperability throughout the session and throughout the whole conference, actually. But maybe we can leave it up here while we talk about any questions that there are. So I'll turn it back over to see if there's questions or discussion that we wanted to talk about.